In this training video, we are going to give you an overview of our guidelines. So in separate training videos, we are going to cover each of the guidelines in more details. But in this training video, we are going to show you a few basic guiding principles that we applied in each of these guidelines. We are also going to discuss different levels and how you can look at your software system, and also explain to you that these guidelines that we have apply on different levels. There are three basic principles that we follow in each of our guidelines. First is that maintainability benefits most from adhering to simple guidelines all the time by everyone. So every individual contribution counts. It means that maintainability is not something that you can solve by some magic solution or that one heroic person can do without help from others. That's something that has to be a team effort in a long time. The second is that maintainability is not an afterthought, but should be addressed from the very beginning of a development project. So this separation of initial development and maintenance mode should not exist. You start to maintain your code from the very beginning. And the third is that perfection is impossible, so you cannot follow all the guidelines all the time, but you should be aware that the more of your system complies with the guideline, the better. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more about this third point. So what you see here are visualizations of two software systems where we present with blocks what we call units of code. These units are, depending on language you use, things like methods, functions. Each of the block is one of these units, methods, or functions. The size of these blocks tells you how many lines of code do you have in each block. And the color of this block tells you how complex are these blocks. So what is the complexity of control flow within them. Now, without going into detail, you can see here two completely different systems in terms of maintainability. So none of them is perfect. All of them have simple as well as complex parts. But you see there is a difference in balance. On the left side, you see something that we call sustainable. Yes, you have few very complex units. Yes, some of them are long. But most of your code is simple, and that's basically what you get when you try to comply to guidelines all the time. So that's something that you can keep under your control, because most of the time you're working on small pieces, simple pieces of code. On the right-hand side is a system that we see as unsustainable, because if you count the lines of code, you see that most of these lines of code are in very big, very complex units. That means that almost every change that you need to do will be made in one of these complex parts, and that's something that's very difficult to maintain. So that's basically what we want to say. Perfection is impossible, but the more elements of your code you have compliant to the guidelines, the better. You can look at the software system at many different ways and many different levels, and our guidelines are also coupled to these levels. So normally when you start to write your system, you work what we call a unit level. So you write some expressions, you write some statements, and you group these statements into what we call units. Depending on language, this unit can be something like a method, procedure, function, or subroutine. We use this more abstract definition of unit in order to make our guidelines apply to many languages. And this also picture shows you how you can apply the guidelines to languages that are different from the example that we are going to show you. The units are the first level that we see in a system, and there are few guidelines that we have for this level. These units then are normally further grouped in what we call modules. So that can be a file, that can be a class with multiple methods, that can be some script. And these modules can then further be grouped into some high-level components that can be top-level directory, a package, a namespace, a Maven submodule, or Visual Studio solution. So you have multiple of these components. And then these components form together a whole system. It's basically code-based, maintained by a team of developers. And our guidelines address always one of these four levels. Here's briefly an overview of all these 10 guidelines, as well as their relation to levels that we described on the previous slide. As I already said, for each of these guidelines, we are going to have a separate training video, but it's just an overview how they relate to our view on software system. So first we have 3 guidelines that relate to unit level, and that's to keep units short, to keep units simple, and to keep unit interfaces small. Then we have guidelines that is basically applied for a whole system, so that you write code once or to avoid writing duplicated pieces of code. The 5th guideline is to carefully separate concerns into separate modules. And then there are 2 guidelines that apply on a component level. And the first is to couple architecture components loosely. And the second is to keep architecture components balanced. Overall, there is also another guideline that says that you should try to keep your code base as small as possible. In addition to these 8 guidelines that we are going to cover with separate videos, we also have 2 kind of more process-related guidelines, and that is to automate tests and to write clean code that apply to everything you do in your system. So this is briefly overview of our guidelines. So we presented you the main principles that we use behind our guidelines. We presented you different levels of how we can look at the software system and explained to you that our guidelines are related to one of these different levels. In next video, we are now going to zoom in the first of these guidelines and explain to you how to write short units and why are they important for maintainability.